What was wrong with building the tower? Why was that a sin? Why was God not pleased? At the very least, they were building the tower because they didn't believe that the flood or the Mabul came as a result of God's displeasure. They thought it was a natural occurrence. So they wanted to do something, either solidify, support the heavens, that they shouldn't fall down again, or they wanted to leave Earth, get out of Earth's atmosphere, and go to the moon, which would be safer. There are no floods on the moon. So they were scientifically very advanced, which we already know that there was a lot of wisdom that was lost. How they build the pyramids, we still can't figure out. How they're able to mummify, to embalm a body to keep it relatively intact for thousands of years. We still don't know how they did it. So there was great information. Adam and Chava were geniuses. They knew everything. But the information was lost because it wasn't shared. Those who had the information wouldn't share it, which is an old trick. You use knowledge as a power to control other people. So there are the haves and the have-nots. There are those who know and those who don't know, and it was part of the evil of that time. So the generation of the flood, the first 1,000 years, were punished with annihilation. The generation of the tower, the second 1,000 years, were punished with dispersion. All of a sudden they were talking different languages and they couldn't continue with their project. Why was the first millennium punished by annihilation, which is very severe, whereas the second, 10 generations that were evil, and they were punished with dispersion. They didn't die, they just went their separate ways. Not nearly as severe a punishment. What was the sin of the first 10 generations? What was their evil? Their evil was that they didn't get along. They were terrible to each other. In terms of how people treated people, they were terrible. They had no question or no doubts about God. So between them and heaven, things were good. But between them and each other, in other words, how they treated earth, they were terrible. So their sins were destructive of society, destructive of life on earth. But they weren't doubtful. They had no questions about God. They believed in God. And they didn't serve idols. That came later. So their sin was against earth, so to speak, not against heaven. The second millennium, between man and man, things were good. They got along, they cooperated. In fact, the biggest problem was that they cooperated. How else could they build a tower to the moon? They were all equally excited about this one project, and they worked together. So obviously they were living in peace with each other. They all spoke the same language, they lived in the same area, and they were working on one project, which is kind of an amazingly good thing. But if the project was bad, it can be an awesomely bad thing. This project was bad. So what was their sin? Their sin was a lack of emunah. They didn't believe in God. They didn't believe the flood came from God. They didn't believe there's punishment. They had problems with heaven. They didn't have problems with earth. Which is a worse sin? You could argue between man and God is much worse. You start up with a person, you don't like people, you're not good to people. Okay, you're also a people. But if you start up with God, that's got to be worse. And yet, the first 10 generations, the first millennium, when they believed in God but were not good to each other, they were punished with death. And the second 10 generations, the second millennium, when they're starting up with God but they're nice to each other, they get a lighter punishment. How come? If you can look at the principle behind it, it's not a question of severe punishment or lesser punishment. That's not the point. The question is not who gets a bigger punishment. The question is, what is the nature of the punishment, because it must fit the crime. So if the crime was that they started up with God, they should be banned from heaven. Started up with heaven, you don't get to go there. If you start up with earth, if you're not good to life on earth, then the appropriate punishment is you don't get to be on earth. So if you start up with heaven, you don't get heaven. If you start up with earth, you don't get earth. So it's not a question of death penalty versus a lesser penalty. It's an appropriate punishment for the sin. So what do we see from this? The second millennium, because they weren't good to each other, were not making earth holier. They were not fulfilling the primary purpose for which the world was created. The world was not created for heaven. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the rest of the Torah is about earth. Heaven is not mentioned again. So obviously, the main purpose of creation is not heaven, but earth. And that's why it follows logically that the ultimate reward is not in heaven, but on earth. Since the main project, the main purpose, the main goal was to make earth holy, when we do make earth holy, where should the reward be? Not in heaven. So that's why the people in the second millennium who were making life on earth better, they deserve to stay on earth. The first 10 generations, the first millennium, because they were destroying life on earth, even though their emunah was good, but they didn't deserve to stay here. So they were removed from the earth. Poetic justice. There is so much to do to make the world better, but if you had to pick one to start with, tzedakah. Tzedakah, the Hebrew word for charity. Get one of these boxes for your home, for your office, for your car, and at every occasion, put in a few coins, making charity and giving a daily habit. It's incredible. The blessings that it brings, the success that it brings, and the help that it offers to people who need. Kolel Chabad. That's my charity of choice. Kolel Chabad, C-O-L-E-L, Chabad. Look it up, get yourself a box, and let's get the world better.